What's up, guys? Today we're going to talk about 5 mid-rangers that I think you should still check out. If you're not into older flagships, I think you guys might like some of these phones, and they're actually a little bit cheaper than they were earlier this year. So one of the first phones is the Poco X3 Pro. This is one of my favorite phones. I actually think this phone is slightly better than the successor, the Poco X4 Pro, simply because the CPU is better and it's cheaper, so it's just better for gaming. And I think that's what attracts a lot of people, especially if you're in the market overseas where this phone is also very popular. This is just a great product, so it's just one of my go-to phones also for the IR blaster. But the design on here, not my favorite, but I think it's fine for what it is. It's just a plastic build. It's IP53 dust and splash proof, and it looks fine. It doesn't feel like super cheap. It actually has a pretty good weight to it. It is an IPS LCD panel, 120 Hz HDR10 at 6.67 inches. It is 1080p 395 for the PPI. Overall, pretty good screen to body ratio. It has the punch hole in the middle. It gets fairly somewhat bright. I don't actually have any issues with the display. No, it's not an OLED or anything like that, but it is a pretty high quality IPS panel, and like I said, it's 120 Hz, so it's buttery smooth. This phone is capable of being upgraded to Android 12 with, of course, the MIUI 13. This phone, the real highlight with this phone is the Snapdragon 860 processor and the Adreno 640 GPU. Basically, this is an excellent gaming phone. PUBG will run at max settings really well. It plays pretty much anything really well at high settings, so I'm always really impressed with performance on this phone. And you can find this easily for around like the $200 price point. This phone is actually very cheap. You also get micro SD card support, 128 gigs of internal storage, 6 or 8 gigs of RAM as well too. And then you have some pretty impressive sounding stereo speakers on here as well. They get pretty loud. This phone also has a headphone jack, which is pretty awesome as well. And like I was saying earlier, you do have an IR blaster on here, and you also have NFC on here as well. The fingerprint scanner is physical and it is side mounted, and it works flawlessly. So the cameras on here, not my favorite on the list, but they are pretty good cameras and good lighting. I just think there are other cameras on this list that are better, but it has a 48 megapixel standard, an 8 megapixel ultra wide, a 2 megapixel macro, and then a 2 megapixel depth sensor. It shoots in 4K 30, and then it has a 20 megapixel selfie cam that shoots in 1080p. So basically, it's a pretty good shooter, as you can tell from the shots. My only issue is sometimes I have to kind of edit the colors. The colors don't come out how I want them. But it gets you good detail, good dynamic range. The ultra wide is fine. The macro is meh, because the 2 megapixel macro cameras just aren't good. But other than that, it's a pretty good shooter. So another highlight with this phone is actually the massive battery. It's a 5,160 milliamp battery with some pretty fast charging. So it's 33 watt charging on here as well too, which is pretty impressive. No wireless charging, but battery life can easily get you well over 6 hours. So this is definitely an all-day phone, at least for me. So a very impressive phone. Next is the iPhone SE 2020. I personally prefer this one over the new SE 2022, simply because there was really not a big upgrade with that phone, right? The newest one. That's why I really didn't bother rushing out to get that phone, because this one is $200 cheaper, right? Because this one's going for 200 bucks. That one's going for like 400, I think 430 or 20, something like that. It's just ridiculous. It's just this phone with 5G. There's no battery improvements. Yeah, the CPU is better, but the CPU in this phone is still extremely good anyway. So this one is just a better deal because it's much cheaper. So SE 2020, awesome phone. Again, with the sort of dated design, which honestly, if you're an Apple fan, you probably don't care. It is a glass and metal design, IP67 dust and water resistant. It is a 4.7 inch Retina IPS display. It's 720p plus 326 for the PPI. The screen is honestly fine for what it is. It's a pretty nice screen. It's pretty sharp. No, it's not OLED or anything like that, but for what it is, it's a pretty decent screen. Yes, it's got chunky bezels and stuff like that, but the benefit with the body design is that it has Touch ID, and a lot of people like that physical home button and stuff like that, so that's also could be a benefit for you. Of course, this is going to get iOS 16 and stuff like that, but the highlight with this phone is still this A13 chip. It's just blazing fast. It's just extremely fast when going in and out of applications, playing games. I mean, just run the Geekbench scores, you'll see that it's still very competitive. as far as, you know, even comparing it to flagship phones, honestly. Of course, you have 64 gigs of internal storage, 3 gigs of RAM. This phone has stereo speakers, which aren't like super loud, but they do a pretty decent job. You do have NFC on here. Like I said, Touch ID is pretty big for people who really like it. And also, this is a very compact phone, so I think people who prefer smaller phones and don't want something really big, you'll actually really like the size of this phone. Also, another highlight, and I think something that has aged a little bit with this phone, is that it's a 12 megapixel sensor, but that's it. There's no ultra wide, there's no telephoto. Shoots in 4K, 24, 30, 60, and then a 7 megapixel selfie cam. The shots actually come out really good on here. I would say almost kind of like flagship quality. I mean, it takes some really great shots. I'm always impressed, especially with the video on here. But like the thing is, like, it's only one lens, right? But video on here, images still look really good on here. As far as just your point and click, I think I'm always pretty impressed with image quality on here, as far as the color and dynamic range and stuff like that. It's a very consistent shooter. You also have on here somewhat not that great battery life, but not terrible. So it's got a 1,821 milliamp hour battery and then 18-watt charging with wireless charging. So here's the thing about the battery: it's 4 hours and 30 minutes ish for screen on time. So basically not exactly a full day, but you can buy a battery case for this phone, honestly, and you can get more out of it. But yeah, just note that, especially if you're a heavy user, you can definitely kill this phone before the day's over. But I think it's still a great bargain for 200 bucks. All right, next is going to be the Pixel 6a, one of my favorite phones on the list when it comes to image quality. I even put this phone up against the 14. A lot of us prefer the Pixel shots there. So this is just awesome for a mid-ranger. It's got somewhat of a premium design. It's aluminum frame, so it still feels really nice in the hand, but it does have a plastic back on it. But like I said, it still feels nice, really looks nice as well. It's IP67, dust and water resistant. I think the only thing with this phone a lot of people didn't like was the OLED display and not having the 90 hertz and stuff like that. Which, if you can get over that, it is a pretty nice display. It's HDR, it's 6.1 inches, so it's fairly compact. 1080p and then 429 for the PPI. So overall, the display quality is still pretty good. It just lacks that 90 hertz. Also, this phone, Android 13, one of the best things about owning a Pixel phone is that you get updates extremely fast, and also it's a stock version, so everything is clean, no bloatware. This phone is running the Tensor chip, so it does a pretty good job loading applications, switching apps. Just general speed is really good on here, and also gaming performance is also very solid. It beats phones like the A53 by a mile, so definitely pretty good on performance here. You get 128 gigs of internal storage and 6 gigs of RAM. Now, you also have pretty good speakers on this phone. You also have pretty good bass on here. Overall, I was pretty impressed. So definitely above average speakers. And this phone has NFC, a fingerprint scanner under the display. It's not the fastest, but it does get the job done. I wish they would add face unlock to it, but I haven't had any issues with it, honestly. And also, this phone does have a 12.2 megapixel standard lens and then a 12 megapixel ultra wide. It shoots in 4K 60, and then you have an 8 megapixel selfie cam that shoots in 1080p 30. Image quality is phenomenal on this phone. It's really the highlight with this phone. It can go against some of the best flagships out right now in terms of just taking stills, and it is just awesome. You get great color, pretty good dynamic range. Google's image processing is just awesome for skin tones and stuff like that. I just think it just looks really, really good on this phone. So whether you're taking selfies or whatever, it's just going to be really consistently great pictures. Also, I think the only thing about this phone is that video is just kind of okay on this phone. I think some of the iPhones like the SE can do a better job in video, but video is just, you know, it's just okay. Also, this phone has pretty good battery life. I haven't had an issue with battery life. So it's a 4,410 milliamp battery. It has 18-watt charging. So basically, you're able to get 6 hours of screen on time fairly easy with this phone. So overall, it's a great pick. Samsung Galaxy A52 5G. I still like this because it's come down in price. I know there's an A53, but this is, I think, a better deal because that A53 wasn't such a big jump, you know, from this phone, and this one has the headphone jack still, and they took it away, I believe. But I really like the design on here. I think it still looks really good for a mid-ranger. You can find these for around $300 to $400. It's IP67 dust and water resistant. It is a plastic phone, but it still feels really solid. One of the best things about this phone is actually the display. I think it has the best display on this list. Is the Super AMOLED 120 Hz HDR10 Plus display at 6.5 inches. It's 1080p 407 for the PPI. Basically, it's a very beautiful display. Like I said, best display on the list. Super smooth, beautiful colors, pretty slim bezels on here. I really like the display on here. And of course, another highlight is the One UI software on here. This phone is upgradable to Android 12 One UI 4.1. And it's just super smooth with a ton of features, which we go over on the channel all the time. It's got the Snapdragon 750G, Adreno 619. Again, not a flagship, quality chip. It's a mid-range chip. So gaming on here is pretty good, but it's mostly for casual gamers. So it gets the job done. Also, you have micro SD card support, 128 gigs of internal storage, and 6 gigs of RAM. Stereo speakers sound really great. It's packed with NFC. Fingerprint scanner under the display, very fast on here as well too. And I think the cameras, I think this would be maybe my second or third favorite cameras. I swap between this and the SE. So it's a 64 megapixel standard and a 12 megapixel ultra wide, but this has more options, so I will go with this one as my second favorite actually. It's a 5 megapixel macro and a 5 megapixel depth. It shoots in 4K 30 with a 32 megapixel selfie cam that also shoots in 4K 30. Basically, you're getting some really great photos on here as well. Really good detailed shots, good dynamic range, good color, great video. It's just an overall very nice shooter, I think, for $400. I don't think anybody would be, unhappy with the image quality here. As far as the battery life, it's a 4,500 milliamp battery with 25 watt charging, and you essentially can get 6 hours of screen on this phone as well too, which is pretty good. So I wouldn't say that the battery life is bad at all on this phone. Alright, so next is the Poco F3. So I've really been enjoying this phone. It's a very powerful phone for such a cheap price here. So you do have a glass back on here. It's IP53 dust and splash proof. Unfortunately, I wish it was IP68 or something like that. But the design on here is something that I really like. It just looks really awesome to me. Also, you have a top tier display on here. It's AMOLED 120 Hz HDR10 Plus. It gets pretty bright at 1300 nits peak brightness, and it's a 6.67 inch display, 1080p 395 for the PPI. Just an awesome display when it comes to color, very good brightness, very thin bezels on here. So it just looks are really great. Now this is running the Android 11. It will get the Android 12 update with the MIUI. It should be getting the Android 13 update actually. But the highlight with this phone is that it has the Snapdragon 870 chipset on here. And this thing is a beast when it comes to performance, guys. It's really fast in terms of playing video games, just in terms of bouncing in and out of applications. It's just a really smooth and fluid phone. I haven't had any issues with performance on here. It's kind of an overkill for this price point. So definitely, that's definitely one of the highlights. You get such a powerful chip for so cheap. Now, you don't get any SD card support. It's 128 gigs of internal storage and then 8 gigs of RAM on here. Stereo speakers on here are pretty good. Not the loudest that I've ever heard, but definitely decent. You also have NFC, and all these Xiaomi phones, a lot of them have the infrared port, which I absolutely love. So I use this phone as a remote control a lot in my house to just control stuff. And that is something that's really awesome that a lot of people kind of sleep on. You also have a fingerprint scanner side mounted on here, and it works great. It's built into the power button. It feels really natural. And I think one of the next highlights with this phone is honestly the cameras on here. It's a triple camera setup. It's a 48 megapixel standard, an 8 megapixel ultra wide, and then a 5 megapixel macro. It shoots in 4K 30, and then a 20 megapixel selfie that shoots in 1080p 60. So image quality is pretty good on this phone. I really do like how it takes pictures, very good detail. You also have good dynamic range on here. The ultra wide is pretty close to the main lens. The macro camera could use a little bit of work, but honestly, I was just really impressed with the just overall image quality on here. Also, the selfie cam also takes some very good shots too. So for the cameras, I still think it's pretty good. So this phone has pretty good battery life as well. It's got a 4,520 milliamp battery. It charges at 33 watts, which is pretty nice. So you know, you're able to charge this phone decently fast, and this is another phone that can easily get you around 6 hours of screen on time pretty easy. So definitely I really like this phone. Powerful chip, great display, great design. It's a lot to like with this phone. So be sure to let me know what you guys think, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.